The horse stood alone at the edge of Coldwater Fork, steam rising from its flanks like a warning no one had spoken out loud. No rider, no tracks leading away, just blood dark and frozen spilled across the snow as if the land itself had been wounded. Miriam Winslow stopped breathing. She should have turned back. She knew that. In places like this, nothing good ever waited at the end of a blood trail. Yet her feet moved anyway, following the crimson line into the birch-white silence, each step dragging her closer to a life she had sworn never to touch again. She found him collapsed in the snow, a Sioux man caught in a steel bear trap, his leg mangled, his breath barely clinging to his chest. Too much blood, too cold, too late. Her hands shook. "Don't," she whispered to herself, to God, to the memory of the last man who had died beneath her touch. Then, breaking into a sob she could no longer hold back, she screamed, "Just don't die under my hands again." Before we continue, if you feel connected to these characters and their struggle, know that you are not just watching, you are walking beside them. Like, share, and subscribe to keep traveling these forgotten roads with us, one story at a time. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to see how far these stories have traveled. Coldwater Fork lay stretched beneath winter like a body held down by ice. The upper Platte region was never kind, but in this season it became merciless wind scraping bare skin raw. Snow crusted hard enough to cut through leather. Silence pressing so heavy it rang in the ears. The river that gave the place its name creaked beneath a skin of frozen water, whispering as it shifted in the dark. Smoke from distant camps never lingered long here. The land swallowed everything quickly: footprints, blood, even grief. Miriam Winslow had learned to move through places like this without leaving much of herself behind. She walked with careful steps, shoulders drawn inward against the cold, her coat worn thin at the elbows. Her hair, once carefully kept, was now bound back in a plain knot, streaked with premature gray that winter had written into her long before age had earned the right. Her face carried a quiet restraint, eyes that avoided lingering too long on any one thing, as if looking closely might awaken something she could not afford to feel. People in the scattered settlements near Coldwater Fork knew her only in fragments. They knew she lived alone. They knew she traded quietly and kept to herself. Some remembered vaguely that she had once worked inside the small frontier hospital along the old wagon route. Fewer spoke of why she left. Miriam did not speak of it at all. Her hands, though now trembling beside the wounded man in the snow, were not unfamiliar with suffering. They bore faint scars, small, pale lines from hurried stitches and broken glass, from nights spent working by lamplight while men bled and cried out for wives who were miles or lifetimes away. Once, those hands had been steady. Once, they had saved lives. Then winter took something from her it never gave back. The memory came uninvited, as it always did when blood met snow. A wagon overturned in the blizzard, a wheel pinning a man she loved to the frozen ground, his breath turning shallow beneath her palms while she begged him to stay awake. The hospital, the bed, the sound his lungs made at the end, the moment she realized that knowing what to do did not mean it would be enough. After that, Miriam Winslow stopped believing in salvation through skill alone. The man lying before her now pulled her back into the present with a faint, broken breath. He was built like the land itself, broad-shouldered, scarred, hardened by seasons spent hunting and surviving where others perished. even unconscious. There was authority in the way his body held tension, as if command had been carved into bone and sinew. The markings on his clothing, the careful craftsmanship of his gear, told her what he was before she knew his name. A Sioux leader, a man who carried more than his own life, somewhere beyond the trees. His people would be looking for him. Miriam swallowed, the cold biting deeper now that fear had found a shape. She had not come here seeking purpose or redemption. She had come because something felt wrong and because, despite everything she had lost, she still knew what a dying man looked like. The land did not care whether she stayed or walked away. Coldwater Fork would erase either choice by morning. But Miriam knelt beside the wounded chief, breath trembling, and realized with a quiet, terrible clarity that the hardest wounds were never the ones you could see. They were the ones that asked you to decide once again whether you dared to try. Miriam stood over the unconscious man for a long moment, her breath clouding the air between them. The wind whispered through the birch trunks, carrying with it the sharp scent of iron and pine sap. She could hear her own heartbeat, loud and uneven, as if her body were arguing with itself. "Walk away," one part of her insisted. "You already know how this ends." The steel jaws of this bear trap were half buried in snow, slick with blood that had darkened to nearly black. One look told her what she did not want to admit. The wound was bad, worse than it first appeared. The leg had been caught hard, flesh torn, bone perhaps damaged, and he had been bleeding for a long time, too long. Miriam took a step back. Her heel crunched against frozen ground, the sound snapping through the quiet like a gunshot. Her chest tightened instantly. For a heartbeat, she expected the world to tilt, to drag her backward into another winter. Another body, pinned and broken beneath her hands. Her fingers curled into her palms until her nails bit skin. "No," she murmured, the word barely more than breath. "Not again." The man stirred then, just slightly. A low sound escaped his throat pain, confusion, instinct. His hand twitched in the snow, fingers flexing as if searching for a weapon that was no longer there, even unconscious. His body reacted like that of a fighter, a survivor. Her gaze flicked to his face, strong features, cut from hard years and harsher choices. A faint scar traced his cheekbone, pale against wind-darkened skin. He looked older than she first thought, not in age, but in weight, the kind that came from leading others through winters that did not forgive mistakes. If she touched him, she would not be able to pretend this was none of her concern. Miriam lowered herself slowly to her knees, the cold biting through wool and bone. The moment her skirts brushed the bloodied snow, a tremor ran through her. Her hands hovered uselessly in the air, shaking despite her effort to steady them. "I can't," she whispered. "I can't do this." But she was already looking, really looking, assessing the way his breath caught, the pallor beneath the dirt, the stiff angle of the trapped limb. She hated herself for how quickly the old habits returned, how her mind slipped back into counting, measuring, judging time by heartbeats. He opened his eyes then, just a slit at first, dark, unfocused. For an instant, fear surged through her so violently she nearly recoiled. She had forgotten how piercing another person's awareness could feel in moments like this, how suddenly the choice became real. The man's gaze found her face, and his body tensed. A sharp intake of breath. His hand jerked weakly toward her. Not an attack, but warning. "Stay," he rasped, the word broken, thick with pain. Miriam froze. "I'm not here to hurt you," she said quickly, her voice trembling despite herself. She lifted her empty hands, palms out, the universal language of no weapon, no threat. "I won't take anything. I just—" His eyes flicked past her, toward the trees, toward the empty space where his horse should have been. Understanding or something close to it passed through his expression, followed by a grim resignation. "Go," he said, the effort costing him dearly. "Leave." The word struck harder than any accusation, because she knew exactly what he meant. Leave him to die. Miriam swallowed. Her throat burned. "If I go," she said softly, "you won't make it through the night." Silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn wire. Snow began to fall again, slow and deliberate, settling into the blood at his side. The man's jaw tightened, his breath shuddered. He looked at her then not as an enemy, not as prey, but as a stranger holding his last chance. "Do it," he said finally, voice barely more than air. "Or don't." That was all the permission she would get. Miriam closed her eyes. When she opened them again, something inside her had already broken loose. She leaned forward, hands reaching for cold iron and torn flesh, knowing with terrible certainty that the moment she touched him, there would be no turning back for either of them. The iron was colder than she expected. Miriam's fingers locked around the jagged edge of the bear trap, the metal biting into her skin as if the land itself resisted being undone. She braced one knee against the snow and pulled. The trap did not move. It never did at first. These things were built to hold against panic, against thrashing muscle and bone, against hope. The man groaned. A sound dragged up from somewhere deep in his chest. His hand clawed weakly at the ground, fingers scraping ice and dirt. "Look at me," Miriam said, the words leaving her before she realized she was speaking aloud. Her voice shook, but she forced it steady. "Don't fight it. You don't have the strength." His eyes found hers again, dark and sharp even through pain. Suspicion lived there, old, practiced. He had learned it young. She could tell. Learned that strangers rarely came without cost. She swallowed and tried again, adjusting her grip, using a fallen branch as leverage. The trap gave a fraction of an inch, then another. Her arms screamed in protest. Sweat gathered beneath her coat despite the cold. "Just hold on," she whispered, though she no longer knew whether she was speaking to him or to herself. With a final, desperate heave, the jaws sprang open. Miriam nearly collapsed as the iron snapped free. She barely caught herself. Breath tearing from her lungs in a sharp gasp, blood flowed immediately, fresh and bright against the snow. The sight made her vision swim. Not again. Please, not again. She pressed her hands down without thinking, firm and unyielding, just as she had been trained to do years ago. The man cried out, his body arching, but he did not pull away. He clenched his teeth, eyes squeezed shut, every muscle rigid with effort. "Easy," she murmured, fighting the tremor in her voice. "I know it hurts. I know." She tore a strip from the lining of her coat and bound the wound as tightly as she dared. Her hands remembered what her heart had tried to forget. Pressure, elevation, stillness, time measured not in minutes, but in breaths. When she finished, she sat back on her heels, shaking so badly she had to fold her arms around herself to keep from falling apart. The man lay gasping, sweat slicking his brow despite the cold. Slowly, so slowly, she almost missed it. His breathing began to steady. "You didn't leave," he said at last, the words hoarse. Miriam looked at him, surprised by how much they cut. "You told me to," she replied. His lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. People say many things when they are dying. The honesty of it startled her. She glanced away, blinking hard. "You shouldn't talk. You need to stay awake." But not like that. She searched the area quickly, dragging him inch by painful inch toward a cluster of fallen branches and rock that broke the wind. Every movement drew a hiss or groan from him, but still he did not strike out, did not curse her, did not tell her to stop. Trust, she realized distantly, was not always loud. Sometimes it was simply the choice not to resist. She gathered dry twigs from beneath the snow, fingers numb and clumsy, and coaxed a flame to life. When the fire finally caught, orange against white, something in her chest loosened just enough for her to breathe again. The man watched her through half-lidded eyes. "You know what you are doing," he said. "I used to," she answered. The fire crackled between them, filling the space with warmth and shadow. She wrapped his leg as best she could, fashioning a crude splint from straight branches and cloth. Her movements were careful, reverent even. Each touch was an apology she could not put into words. He studied her face while she worked. "You are afraid," he said quietly. Miriam's hands faltered. "Yes, of me." She shook her head. "Of failing." Something shifted in his expression, then recognition, perhaps, or respect. He turned his gaze toward the fire, jaw tightening. "I am called Coda Grey Wolf," he said after a moment. "You should know the name of the man you chose not to abandon." The weight of it settled over her. A name carried power, meaning, responsibility. "Miriam Winslow," she replied. "And I didn't choose you. I chose not to walk away." Coda let out a slow breath. Sometimes that is the same thing. The fire burned steadily as the light began to fade from the sky. Snow continued to fall, soft and relentless. But within the small circle of warmth they shared, something fragile had taken root. Not safety, not peace, but the first quiet thread of trust born not from promises, but from pain endured together. They found them at dusk. It was not the sound of hooves that reached Miriam first, but the sudden stillness in the woods, the way birds went silent, the way the wind seemed to draw back as if sensing the arrival of something heavier than weather. Coda felt it too. His body tense beside the fire, shoulders tightening despite the pain. "They are close," he said quietly. Miriam looked up just as shadows began to move between the trees. The Sioux warriors emerged without haste, as if the forest itself had parted to let them through. Their horses steamed in the cold, nostrils flaring, eyes sharp and alert. Spears and rifles were not raised, but they were not lowered either. Every movement was measured, controlled. The moment they saw Coda, the tension broke like ice under sudden weight. They dismounted quickly, voices rising in their own tongue, urgent, relieved, edged with anger at whatever had brought their chief so close to death. One of them knelt beside Coda immediately, hands hovering as if afraid to touch him too roughly. Miriam instinctively stepped back, palms open, heart pounding. She had known this moment would come. She had simply hoped to be more prepared. Coda lifted a hand. The warriors fell silent at once. "I am alive," he said, his voice rough but steady. "Because of her." Every gaze snapped to Miriam. The air shifted, suspicion surged, thick and immediate. A white woman, alone, beside their wounded chief, blood on her hands, She did not trap me. Coda continued. She freed me. She stopped the bleeding. She kept me warm. A murmur moved through the group. Some eyes softened. Others hardened. Miriam swallowed, unsure whether to speak or remain still. Coda turned his head toward her, his expression calm in a way that surprised her. You are safe now, he said, not just to her, but to himself. My people are here. And for the first time since she had found him in the snow, Miriam believed him. The warriors fashioned a litter quickly, their movements practiced. They lifted Coda with care, securing his injured leg. One of them offered Miriam a curt nod, not friendly, not hostile, simply acknowledgement. They began to turn back toward the trail. Miriam stepped forward. No, she said. The words slipped out sharper than she intended. Several warriors stiffened. Hands moved closer to weapons. Coda frowned slightly, confused. You should go, he said gently. You have done enough. Miriam's breath caught. Enough. The word struck deeper than any blade. If you leave now, she said, forcing her voice steady, you might die. The forest seemed to lean closer. Coda studied her face, really studied it this time. He saw the fear there. Yes, but something else beneath it. Determination, urgency, knowledge. The bleeding is controlled, he said. My people will care for me. They don't know what I know, Miriam replied, stepping closer despite the way every instinct screamed at her to stop. The trap tore deep. The tissue was crushed. If infection sets in, and it will, unless the wound is cleaned properly, you won't last a week. Fever will take you long before the leg does. The words spilled out faster now, carried by a force she hadn't felt in years. Not panic. Purpose. One of the warriors spoke sharply, mistrust flaring. Miriam didn't understand the words, but she understood the meaning. Coda raised his hand again, silencing him. His gaze never left hers. You speak with certainty, he said. I speak from experience, she answered. Her voice wavered for just a moment. I've watched men survive injuries like this, and I've watched them die when the sickness came after. I won't pretend this is over, just because you're conscious now. Silence stretched between them, taut and dangerous. You owe me nothing, Coda said quietly. I know, Miriam replied. That's not why I'm asking. Then why? Because I can't walk away again. Because if you die, I will see his face all over again. Because I need to know my hands are not cursed. She did not say those things. Instead, she said, because you trusted me when you were helpless, and because I am not finished keeping you alive. Coda's jaw tightened. Something unreadable passed through his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or respect, or the first flicker of something deeper. He turned to his warriors and spoke briefly. They listened, tense, conflicted. One shook his head. Another glanced back at Miriam with open suspicion. At last, Coda looked at her again. You would leave your safety, he said slowly, and walk into a camp that does not know you. For this, yes, Miriam said, without hesitation. Even knowing what my people may think of you. Yes, even knowing you might be blamed if I worsen, yes. The certainty in her voice startled them both. Coda exhaled slowly, a sound heavy with more than pain. You are a difficult woman to argue with, Miriam Winslow. She almost laughed. Almost. Very well, he said at last. You will come, not as a command, not as a favor, as an acknowledgement of necessity. The warriors adjusted their formation, one of them gesturing sharply for Miriam to stay close, but not too close. She obeyed, heart racing, aware that every step now carried her farther from the life she had built around avoidance. As they moved through the trees toward the distant glow of the campfires, Miriam walked beside the litter, eyes never leaving Coda. He had found safety. He knew it. But she knew something else. The real danger had only just begun. Because it was one thing to pull a man back from the edge of death in the wilderness. It was another thing entirely to convince an entire people to let you try again. The Sioux camp revealed itself slowly, as if the land were deciding whether to allow Miriam Winslow to see it at all. First came the smell of smoke and tanned hide, then the low murmur of voices, the shapes of tippies rising from the snow like pale ghosts. Fires burned low against the cold, their light flickering across faces that turned the instant the warriors appeared. Faces that tightened when they saw who lay wounded upon the litter. And then those faces hardened when they saw her. Miriam felt it immediately. The shift, the way conversation died, the way bodies subtly moved between her and the centers of the camp. She had walked into hostile rooms before hospital wards where men screamed at her in pain. Towns that looked at a woman alone with suspicion, but this was different. This was not anger. This was fear. Coda Gray Wolf was carried toward the largest lodge, his jaw clenched, his breath uneven but controlled. He did not look at her as they moved, but Miriam stayed close enough to see the strain in his face, the sweat beginning to beat at his temples despite the cold. The firelight revealed what the snow had hidden, swelling creeping up his leg, the skin flushed and tight. Too fast, she thought. That's too fast. They laid him down on pelts near the fire. The warmth should have eased him. Instead, his breath hitched. Miriam stepped forward instinctively and stopped. A woman moved between them. She was younger than Miriam had expected. Her dark hair braided tight, her eyes bright with panic and fury tangled together. She dropped to her knees beside Coda, hands hovering over him as if afraid to touch. Maka, Coda murmured. The name carried weight. Blood. Kin. Maka Snow. Flower turned then, her gaze snapping to Miriam like a blade. She took in the woman's pale face, her foreign clothing, the blood stains still dark against her gloves. Something inside her broke open. Her voice rose sharply, words spilling out in Sioux fast, accusing, edged with terror. Others joined in, murmurs growing louder, darker. Miriam did not understand the language, but she understood the meaning well enough. Outsider, danger, curse. She thinks I did this, Miriam said quietly, more to herself than anyone else. Maka's hand flew up, pointing, her voice cracking as she spoke again. One word cut through even without translation. Witch. Miriam's chest tightened. She opened her mouth to explain, to speak of infection, of crushed flesh and poisoned blood, but no one was listening. The fear in the camp had found a shape, and it wore her face. She saved me, Coda said, his voice low but firm. Maka shook her head violently, tears streaking down her cheeks. She clutched his hand, pressing it to her forehead, speaking rapidly as if prayer and warning had become the same thing. She believes your wound is a curse, one of the warriors said stiffly, translating just enough, that your weakness comes from her touch. Miriam took a breath and forced herself to stand her ground. His wound is infected, she said clearly. The trap crushed the flesh. The sickness is already moving. If you don't let me clean it properly, the fever will enough." The warrior snapped. Maka rose, stepping fully between Miriam and her brother now, arms spread in a silent barrier. Her eyes never left Miriam's. Koda tried to sit up. Pain tore through him, stealing his breath. He sank back down with a sharp gasp. Miriam surged forward again without thinking and again was stopped. "No," Maka said in broken English, her voice trembling but resolute. "You not touch him." The words struck harder than any blow. Miriam felt the old familiar helplessness claw its way up her throat. The room blurred, the firelight smearing into orange streaks as another memory threatened to drag her under a hospital bed. A man she loved slipping away, while others told her to stop, to wait, to pray. "I can help him," she said, her voice barely holding. "Please." Maka shook her head, fear twisting her features into something almost unrecognizable. "You already hurt him." Koda's breathing grew faster. His skin burned beneath Miriam's gaze now, flushed deep and wrong. She stepped back slowly, hands curling into fists at her sides. If she pushed now, they might throw her out, or worse. If she did nothing, she backed away from the fire, each step feeling like surrender. The lodge seemed to close in around her, voices rising again in uneasy waves. From the edge of the camp, Miriam watched Koda shiver violently beneath the pelts, watched Maka cling to him, whispering desperate words to the spirits she trusted. And for the first time since she had followed the blood into the snow, Miriam felt the full weight of the truth settle over her. Saving a man in the wilderness was one thing. Saving him here inside a world that feared her might cost her everything she had left. She folded her arms around herself as night fell over the camp, and prayed that Koda Grey Wolf would live long enough to ask for her help again. Night settled over the camp like a held breath. The fires burned lower now, their light dulled by a sky heavy with cloud and snow. Miriam sat alone at the edge of the camp, her back against a cold log, hands clenched in her lap to keep them from shaking. Every sound carried too far in the dark, the snap of wood, the murmur of voices, the restless shifting of horses. None of it reached her as sharply as the memory pounding behind her eyes. She had seen this before. A man burning with fever. A room full of people who believed prayer was enough. Hands pushed away because fear needed someone to blame. Inside the largest lodge, Koda Grey Wolf drifted in and out of awareness. Heat rolled through him in waves, leaving him shivering beneath the pelts. His leg throbbed with a deep, relentless pain that no position could ease. Every breath scraped his chest raw. Maka, Snowflower, knelt beside him, tears streaking silently down her face as she pressed her forehead to his hand. She whispered prayers between sobs, calling on spirits she had trusted all her life. But fear hollowed her words. She had lost too many already: an uncle to fever, a cousin to a wound that turned black and foul. The signs were there. She saw them. She simply could not bear to believe them again. Koda groaned softly, his fingers tightening around hers. "Maka," he murmured. She lifted her head instantly. "I am here." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, pupils blown wide by heat and pain. The firelight danced strangely across his vision. For a moment, he seemed to look past her, past the lodge, past the camp, past the night itself. Then his gaze sharpened, locking onto her face with sudden clarity. "She must come," he said. Maka froze. "You must let her help me." The words landed like a blow. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "You are sick. You speak from fever." Koda's grip tightened, surprising her with its strength. His breath hitched. But his eyes did not waver. "I was dying in the snow," he said slowly, each word dragged up with effort. "She did not leave me. She cut the iron. She stopped the blood." Maka's chest rose sharply. "She is wrong for us," she said desperately. "Her ways bring sickness." Kota shook his head. The motion small but deliberate. The sickness was already there. Silence swallowed the lodge. Outside, Miriam stared into the darkness, unaware that her name hovered on the edge of a choice she had no control over. Her mind replayed the moment she had stepped back, hands empty, heart splintering as she watched the firelight close around him without her. Inside, Kota's breathing grew labored. Sweat soaked his hair, plastering loose strands to his temples. His body shuddered violently. Maka pressed her hand to his chest, panic breaking through her fear. "Brother, listen to me," Kota said, his voice cracking at last. "If I die, let it not be because you were afraid." The words cut deeper than accusation ever could. Maka's vision blurred. She bowed her head, her shoulders trembling as she fought the truth rising inside her. She had wanted to protect him. She had wanted to believe the spirits alone would answer. But her brother was slipping away. Slowly, agonizingly, she looked toward the lodge opening. "Bring her," she said hoarsely. The words tasted like surrender. A moment later, a shadow fell across Miriam Winslow. She looked up, startled, heart hammering. The warrior did not meet her eyes. "You are needed," he said simply. Miriam rose on unsteady legs, dread and hope twisting together in her chest. As she followed him toward the lodge, the past rose up to meet her. Another firelit room, another man burning with fever, another chance to fail. Her hands trembled, but this time, she did not turn away. As she stepped inside, Maka Snowflower moved aside, her face pale and stripped bare of anger, leaving only fear and grief behind. Miriam knelt beside Kota Grey Wolf, pressing her fingers to his burning skin, and felt the truth settle with terrible clarity. This was the moment that would decide everything, not just whether he lived, but whether she ever believed in her hands again. The fever did not break quickly. Miriam knew better than to expect mercy. She worked through the night, moving with a quiet urgency that surprised even her. There was no hesitation now, only precision shaped by memory and loss. She cleaned the wound again and again, washing away blood and rot, cutting back dead tissue with a steadiness she had once believed was gone forever. She cooled Kota's burning skin with cloth and water, measured his breaths, listened to the rhythm of his heart as if it were a language she had nearly forgotten how to speak. Kota drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes calling her name, sometimes speaking to ghosts she could not see. At times he fought her touch, delirium tightening his muscles. At others, his hands sought hers with blind instinct, fingers curling weakly as if anchoring himself to the world through her alone. Maka, Snowflower, remained close, silent now. Her fear transformed into watchfulness. She brought fresh water when Miriam asked. She held the lamp steady. She said nothing, but she did not leave. Near dawn, Kota's breathing changed. It came slower, deeper, less ragged. Miriam froze, every sense sharpening. She pressed her fingers to his wrist, counting, waiting for the familiar betrayal of a pulse that faded when hope rose too fast. But it did not fade. The fever still burned, but it no longer climbed. She exhaled shakily, the sound breaking free from her chest like a sob she had been holding for years. "He's turning," Miriam said softly, If his strength holds, he'll live. The words hung in the air, fragile as frost. Maka sank to her knees, one hand covering her mouth. Tears spilled freely now, unchecked, streaking down her cheeks as she bowed her head. When she looked up again, her eyes met Miriam's for the first time without anger. "I was afraid," she said quietly, "afraid the spirits were taking him, afraid I would lose him like the others." Miriam nodded. "So was I." The truth of it bound them more tightly than apology ever could. By midday, Koda woke fully. The firelight revealed the change immediately. The sharp edge of death had receded from his face. He looked weaker, thinner, but his eyes were clear, present, alive. When he saw Miriam beside him, exhaustion softened his features. "You stayed," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "I told you I wasn't finished." Word spread through the camp slowly at first. Then all at once, the chief had survived. The fever had been driven back. People came to the edge of the lodge, peering in with cautious wonder. Some nodded to Miriam. Others laid small offerings near the fire meat. Hide, carved tokens, gestures of gratitude spoken without words. That evening, Koda was helped outside, wrapped in pelts, the winter air sharp but clean in his lungs. The camp gathered in a wide circle, faces lit by fire and relief. Koda stood with effort, supported on one side, but his voice carried clearly. "This woman," he said, laying a hand over his chest, "pulled me back from the snow. She did not fear my blood. She did not fear your anger. She stayed." A murmur moved through the people. "Our ways say a life saved binds honor." He continued, "She will remain here, under my protection, until the debt is answered." It sounded like the judgment of a chief, a matter of custom, of balance. But when the gathering dispersed and the night grew quiet, Koda found Miriam alone by the dying fire. "That was not the whole truth," he said. She looked up at him. "I could have let you leave," he continued, "even knowing the debt. But I did not want you to go." Silence stretched between them, warm and dangerous. "When I lay in the snow," Koda said softly, "I felt peace for the first time in many winters. Not because I was ready to die, but because someone chose not to leave me there." Miriam's throat tightened. "I do not know what comes next," he said, "but I know this. I want you here. Not because I owe you, because I choose you." The fire crackled low between them, sending sparks into the cold air. For the first time since the wagon overturned in the storm, since her hands had failed the man she loved, Miriam Winslow did not feel like she was standing at the edge of something she could not survive. She felt tentatively, painfully, like she had stepped back into the world. Winter still held Coldwater Fork in its grip, but beneath the snow, something had begun to thaw, and this time she stayed.